President.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
President. Madam President, Senator Ryan in her presentation asked the very relevant and poignant question, how much has Trinidad and Tobago been stymied by partisan politics and changes in policies? And that is a question that concerns at least those of us on this side. I would like to say for the record that when it comes to the economy of Trinidad and Tobago, the status of Trinidad and Tobago, our ability to satisfy our international obligations, this party does not work on the basis of partisan politics and changes in policies. We are about determining what is best for the people of Trinidad and Tobago and moving forward on that basis, which is why when we came into office, recognized that this obligation had been undertaken by the previous administration. We didn't sit back and say, well, they took on the obligation, they did nothing. Let us go to the public and say, well, it's not our fault, and throw up our hands. What we did instead is we rolled up our sleeves. In particular, the Attorney General and his team rolled up their sleeves, got to work to determine what we could do to effectively address the deficiencies in implementation of the obligations that had been undertaken, and we are still about doing that, Madam President. Senator Richards indicated through you, Madam President, that we are at fault of not using the same information in TNT that we supply to others, and that we need to address that. And I agree with you completely through you, Madam President. I agree with Senator Richards completely on that issue. And as somebody in the Ministry of Finance with a particular focus on tax, it is certainly the intention that we use both the information that we gather here and the information we receive through exchange of information for the benefit and purpose of Trinidad and Tobago. It is actually for the very reason that we want to take advantage of the information we have for local purposes, that we have the amendments in the legislation that allows the Board of Inland Revenue to share information with the local police and with the local FIU so that they can be more effective in their quest to identify and deal with these financial crimes. So we are about ensuring that Trinidad and Tobago benefits as well directly from its involvement in this process. In respect of the gaming legislation that Senator Richards as well raised, it is important that we pass this legislation. I agree with you completely. As the members of this House know, this legislation is before a Joint Select Committee because it too requires a special majority to be passed. The gaming sector is one of those that needs regulation. It is one of those that can easily be used for money laundering and other illicit activities, and we do need to bring it under control. But to do that, we have to act together, because without special legislation, we can only go so far. Again, Senator Richards, Madam President, raised the issue of the questionable nature of the confidentiality of information. And although I am one of those to point out the deficiencies in the operations of the Board of Inland Revenue, I am very comfortable that they hold their oath of secrecy very dearly, and they are not wont to violate that oath. I don't know that any of us can say that we got confidential information on citizens in Trinidad and Tobago from the Board of Inland Revenue. And
my concern was not the BIR, it was the TT Police Service.
Yes, I started with the Board of Inland Revenue. This information is to be shared with the Trinidad and Tobago Police Force and the FIU. And again, although there may be questions on the operation of those, of certainly the TT Police, we have had the financial unit of that organization operating for a while. And again, I am not aware of any breaches of confidentiality in that unit. I may be wrong, but I am not aware of any. Similarly, the FIU as well has held closely to their oath of secrecy. In addition to the practice that we have seen in the past, you will acknowledge that the legislation seeks to enhance the level of security of information by imposing very heavy penalties on any breach by any of those officers of their confidentiality obligation. So we have tried to heighten the level of protection that citizens will enjoy if and when this legislation is passed. So we are absolutely aware of that issue and concerned about it as well, so we are seeking to treat with it. On the issue of whether CARICOM should have petitioned the group, petitioned the G20 as a group, while individual countries had to decide individually on when they would sign on to this obligation because they individually knew what actions they would have to take, what responsibilities that accepting that obligation would bring. There has been discussion among CARICOM in terms of approaching the G20 as a group. In particular, the focus of that discussion is to revolve around the attempt by G20 in its quest to limit tax avoidance of removing special regimes within the Caribbean and the rest of the world. So St. Lucia and Barbados and St. Kitts and Grenada all have offshore legislation that allows them to register persons to pay either no tax or a low rate of tax. And these are external companies, hopefully providing external services, but bringing foreign exchange to the country. They're also seeking to have Trinidad and Tobago remove its tax-free zone, its free zone legislation. And so in respect of those issues, we are seeking to approach the Global Forum as a group.
Interrupt you again, but my concern with CARICOM not approaching this issue as a grouping is also in light of the fact that, just for conversation's sake, imagine Trinidad and Tobago were blacklisted, or any island. It affects the other economies, because there's a ripple effect. If Trinidad and Tobago's economy crumbles, it affects St. Lucia, Barbados, Grenada, etc. And that was one of my big concerns with CARICOM not addressing as a group.
Senator Richards, I hear you, and I do understand that, but imagine the position that Trinidad and Tobago is in, even in having that conversation with the rest of the Caribbean, where the vast majority, where everybody in the Caribbean who has assumed the responsibility with a 2018 obligation have satisfied those obligations. And we, because of our internal issues, have not been able to. That is a difficult conversation to have. So it is much easier from my perspective to say, okay, we all have this universal problem of the special regimes we have put in to stimulate our economy. Let's go to the G20 with that. Helping me to deal with my internal politics, a lot more difficult situation, but I hear you. So, Madam President, I have talked about the issue of tax avoidance and tax evasion, which is a global problem. I have talked about the fact that even powerhouse entities like the IRS and the UK tax authority have difficulty reining in their citizens and their corporations and ensuring that they collect all the taxes that they collect, that they are entitled to. I've talked about the leakages, and in that context, we can only imagine what the leakage is for Trinidad and Tobago. I have mentioned the fact that these entities have all seen it necessary to embark on a program of sharing of tax information so that everybody can ensure that there is effective collection of taxes from their constituents by getting information from other sources. I have talked about the fact that we have recognized that from the energy sector alone, we have identified a $6 billion leakage. Now, imagine what $6 billion can do for Trinidad and Tobago. Our public sector investment program for the last 3 years has been around $5 billion. Imagine what we could do if we double that. Imagine the road program we could introduce. Imagine what we could do with our hospitals. We are struggling to finish building the Port of Spain Central Block, the Point Fortin Hospital, the Sangre Grande Hospital, because we have to manage the money while we pay public servants and so on. Imagine what we could do if we could double our PSIP. And we would be able to do that if we had a system in place that allowed us to collect all the information we needed to minimize the leakages from our system. So that, Madam President, as I said, we do have international obligations. And we do want to meet those international obligations because there are serious consequences of not meeting them. Senator Diona Ryan pointed some of those out to the public, and I'm sure other speakers later on will also focus on that. But also, if we fail to do this, we are doing ourselves an injustice by not giving ourselves the tools to properly police the tax compliance system, to give the TTPS the tools they need and give the FIU the tools it needs to pursue financial crime, all of which are very significant for our economy, for our country, for our social structure, for our peace of mind. This legislation does not go as far as we would like it to go. We have things to do, but we needed to make some progress by the due date in order to report, in order to be given more time. And in those circumstances, I stand here in support of the bill, and I ask you to support it. I thank you very much, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam President, for allowing me to rise at this time to make my intervention and contribution to the Income Tax Amendment Bill 2018. Madam President, let me say from the very outset that the opposition has always been committed to passing legislation to become compliant with Global Forum and FATF requirements. We said this from the very beginning, and any governmental statements indicating anything otherwise are only unwarranted, and not only unwarranted, but are also made in ignorance of the clearly stated position of the opposition. Madam President, you would recall that the opposition in 2017 spent a lot of time in the JSC hammering out details of the FATCA legislation, and it was eventually passed. We believe that the bill that is before us should have been handled differently in the JSC before being reported to us here in the Senate and in the other place. Madam President, you would recall that when this matter went before JSC, the notes are there to confirm, because on the public record, that the Minister of Finance, who was then chairman, indicated that the three bills were interrelated and they had to be dealt with conjointly. Later on, we were told that only two bills were needed to be dealt with conjointly, leaving out the convention, the one on the treaty, the income tax amendment bill, and the administrative bill on mutual assistance in taxation matters. And then we were then told, Madam President, that only the income tax amendment bill would be needed for us to get off what is called the non-compliant list. So here we are today, the government having gone all over the place, trying to convince the country that the opposition is responsible for what has happened. But the reality is the government is not serious. And if you go through the verbatim notes, Madam President, you will see that throughout, the government was just engaging in what I call a mama guy exercise. They were just trying to give the impression to the Global Forum and to FATF that they were doing something, Madam President. Madam President, I will just read from the Express of November the 23rd, an article by Camille Hunt. And the headline is, "Tax Bill Must Pass or Trinidad and Tobago Faces Blacklisting." And this section of the article that reads, and I quote, "When the Global Forum publishes its report and this country is not able to respond by saying, we have passed the income tax amendment bill, we are going to be blacklisted and the application of sanctions will be death by 1,000 cuts. We have warned Trinidad and Tobago repeatedly over the course of 2 full years that this requirement had to be dealt with." End of quote. This is the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago in an Express article on the date that I've mentioned, Madam President, and quoted November 23rd. So what the Attorney General was saying to the entire country was that for 2 years, Madam President, the government dilly-dallied on this very important matter. For 2 years. And they came at the 11th hour when they realized certain deadlines were approaching and tried to bully the opposition in supporting, Madam President, bad law. Madam President, I want to remind this House that 350,000 citizens voted for the United National Congress. And when they voted for us, they didn't vote for us to come in here and be the plaything of the PNM or to be bullied by the PNM in getting, Madam President, what they call special majority constitutional legislation through. That is not our role. Madam President, I will show you this evening that the bill that we have before us here is still draconian in nature, very draconian in nature. And it puts too much power in the hands of the executive. And that power can be abused, as we have seen in the past. Madam President, this legislation, which is supposed to deal with exchange of information between the European Union and Trinidad and Tobago, and to deal with tax transparency, targets every citizen, Madam President. I thought, Madam President, legislation dealing with tax transparency and the exchange of information between the European Union, represented by the Global Forum, because they are part of it, and other countries, 154. I thought that was dealing with Europe and citizens of Europe who were in Trinidad and Tobago, and they were evading taxes and avoiding taxes. But I didn't know, Madam President, that ordinary citizens of Trinidad and Tobago were going to be included in a income tax amendment bill. This bill is not about the European Union and Global Forum. This is political legislation. This is political legislation, Madam President. And the government has sneaked in certain provisions in the legislation to give them what they consider to be an upper hand in invading people's privacy. That is what the government is attempting to do. And they want us, Madam President, to support that. How can we support that? Madam President, may I remind you, I have the Income Tax Act before me. Madam President, as the Honorable Attorney General reminded us earlier, there have been over 109 amendments to the Income Tax Act. It has been in existence for 69 years. It is what is called saved law. It is Act number 34 of 1938. No government since independence has sought to interfere with Section 4 of this particular Income Tax Act that deals with secrecy and confidentiality. We are being told by the PNM that they have been instructed by external forces, Madam President, to remove, Madam President, that secrecy provision so that what? The police can have free access to every citizen taxation information. Madam President, the government is not right in its mind. How for almost 69 years we have a provision in the Income Tax Act that protects the privacy and personal data and information of every citizen who files his tax return with the Board of Inland Revenue, Madam President, that no worker within that Board of Inland Revenue can reveal that information to anybody. You could make jail, Madam President. And that is why you have a secrecy form that you have to swear to before a magistrate. So this is sacred, it is secret, it is confidential. And why are we being forced as a parliament to remove that provision in order to allow the police at the rank of a superintendent and above? And Madam President, I have the greatest respect for the police service. I'm a citizen of this country. But Madam President, we have to face reality. There are rogue elements in the police service. There are corrupt elements in the police service. And they will use information for political purposes. We know that there are police officers who are PNM members and supporters. So, Madam President, we have to ensure that there are proper checks and balances so that the rights and freedoms of the citizens of this country are not jeopardized, compromised, or subverted. And we took an oath as members of this parliament that when we came in here as senators, we shall uphold the law and the Constitution. That is what we are doing today. We are upholding the law and we are upholding the Constitution, Madam President. And we are not going to allow the PNM in any way to persuade any one of us to do otherwise. Madam President, I want to share with you this evening a provision in the legislation. Madam President, Clause 4 of the legislation, Section A, that is 4 Roman 1, I would say 4A, from what I'm seeing is on page 2 of this bill. And if I may be allowed, Madam President, it says the following: notwithstanding subsections 1 and 2, a person having an official duty or being employed in the administration of this act, Madam President, shall, for the purposes of subsection 5, do the following. A, provide taxpayer information. When you say taxpayer information, Madam President, it means any and every taxpayer in Trinidad and Tobago. To the Director of the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago, hereinafter refer to the FIU for the purpose of enabling the FIU to do its analysis under the Financial Intelligence Unit of TNT Act. Madam President, we have no problem with the FIU doing their work. There are criminal elements operating in this society, and they are using all kinds of means to gather wealth. Go after them. We have no problem with that. Get the evidence, jail them. We have no problem with that. Madam President, let us balance the rights and interests of the state with that of the citizens in terms of their freedoms and their liberties. Because once you begin to remove rights, you realize it is hard to replace those rights and have them returned. Madam President, I want to ask you to join me as we go through what is called the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago Act. Madam President, Section 16 says that the FIU may, in the performance of its functions, cooperate and liaise with any person who, in the opinion of the director, is able to assist in the provision of information relevant to the analysis of a suspicious transaction or suspicious activity. It goes on in subsection 2. Notwithstanding subsection 1, the FIU, Madam President, may, in the performance of its function, request information from the central bank, from a public authority. And a public authority, in accordance with the definition in this act that I have before me, states a public authority means a ministry or a department or a division of a ministry. So right now, in this piece of legislation, there is a provision, Madam President, where the FIU may request information from, let's say, the Board of Inland Revenue. It goes on further in subsection 4, where it says, where a person fails to provide the requested information or fails to provide it in a reasonable time under subsection 2 and 3, the director may apply to a judge for an order, which is a production order, to direct that person to comply with the request made under subsection 2. So in the legislation before us, the director of the FIU may request information from the Board of Inland Revenue. And if they do not get the information based on request within a reasonable time, Madam President, the Act says that they may go to the court, go to a judge in chamber to get a production order to compel the Board of Inland Revenue to provide them with information. Now, they are giving us the impression, Madam President, that right now, the FIU has no power to get information from the Board of Inland Revenue. And under the legislation, they have that power. Madam President, here what the government intends to do. It's a trick, but the Constitution trumps this trick. And that is why I am not a lawyer, but I'll accompany my colleague, Gerald Ramdeen, as a bush lawyer. Once this becomes law and is assented to, I will accompany him to the courts of Trinidad and Tobago to have this struck down as unconstitutional. Madam President, here what the government has done. They have moved from May in this provision here, Madam President, and in the amendment that we have before us, here what the government has strict us and has brought into the legislation. Whereas under 16, subsection 3, 1, 2, and 3, they may request. The government is now proposing in this amendment, Madam President, that the Board of Inland Revenue shall provide taxpayer information to the Director of the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, they moved from May in the Act, and they have now introduced in the amendment where they are now compelling the BIR to provide information to the Director of the FIU. Madam President, I am no lawyer, but I have good colleagues who are lawyers, and they have advised me. I want to refer you to Section 6 of our Constitution. It deals with something called exceptions to existing law. Madam President, it says under 6(1)(c), it reads, it begins by saying, nothing in sections 4 and 5 shall invalidate. C, an enactment that alters an existing law, but does not derogate from any fundamental right guaranteed by this chapter in a manner in which or to an extent to which the existing law did not previously derogate from that right. Madam President, I enjoy a certain right under Section 4 and 5 of the Constitution. Right to privacy. Under the Income Tax Act, I have a right to have my data protected. It is secret and confidential. If you are now seeking to reduce that right, Madam President, this is saved legislation. You are seeking to abridge my right. You are seeking to reduce my right. Madam President, you need a special constitutional majority to do so. You cannot reduce my rights, Madam President, through trickery. And that is what the government is trying to do here this evening. They want to invade every taxpayer private database at their whims and fancy. You can use crooked and corrupt police officers to invade the sacred spaces of the Board of Inland Revenue, get information, and use that information for political purposes and for all kinds of nefarious acts. Madam President, we will not and never permit that to take place in this country. So, Madam President, we are very, very concerned. And Madam President, you know what is even more frightening? I went through what is called the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force report. Madam President, it is dated June 2016, Mutual Evaluation Report. But before I go there, my honorable colleague is not here. the Honorable Attorney General. But I want to tell you, Madam President, or bring to your attention, the Attorney General, in his statement today, in his presentation, said that all the stakeholders that came before the Special Select Committee, which came live, and on the public channel, Channel 11, ParlView. I looked at it, Madam President. I'm a frequent looker, Madam President, of the ParlView channel, as you know. It's very close to my heart. And I looked at it, and I saw the various entities that were there. And one of the entities that I paid attention to was the Board of Inland Revenue. One, Mrs. Raphael. She is the chairman of that Board of Inland Revenue. And the AG said today, Madam President, that everybody agreed. They had no objection. Well, Madam President, Mrs. Raphael had an objection. She said that right now, whenever the police wants information, they are able to provide the information for the police through a production order. And they would like the government to have that position retained. It is in the record. The Board of Inland Revenue said they would like the status quo to retain. So if the police want information, rather than have the carte blanche and power to just invade the sacred spaces of the BIR, Madam President, they must go to a judge in chamber, go with the evidence, have a high threshold standard of evidence to prove that they have a case, and on that basis and so on, they can be issued with a production order, and they could go to the BIR, and the BIR will comply. The chairman of the board of BIR said they want the status quo to remain. The AG came here today and told the whole world that everybody agreed. That is not so. But, Madam President, I raised that a passant. Madam President, may I also remind you, the mutual evaluation report of June 2016, Madam President, income tax is referred to on page 15, 17, 27, 39, 54, 112, 117, 169. And nowhere, Madam President, in these pages that I looked at income tax, did the CFATF tell the government of Trinidad and Tobago to go and change the secrecy provision in that legislation. Nowhere in this act, nowhere in this report, Madam President, did they tell the government that. So I challenge the government today. They have been telling us, Madam President, FATF and CFATF have been telling them to change the secrecy provision. Where in this mutual report of 2016 and FATF reports, that provision or that demand or that proposal is made to the government. Madam President, I am telling this Honorable Senate this evening that the government is suffering from a credibility crisis. We heard from the Honorable Minister of Energy this evening that every Petrogen worker was paid. I have just received information that thousands of Petrogen workers are yet to be paid. There is a credibility crisis in the government. You cannot believe, Madam President, what they are saying.
Can't trust them.
So, Madam President, if you want us, Madam President, may I just give you a piece of information I got recently. In the British House of Commons, the Theresa May government gave an undertaking to the House of Commons that they will make full and frank disclosure via legal opinion on the Brexit deal. You know what they did, Madam President? The AG, like our AG, came to the House of Commons and gave the House of Commons an overview of the legal opinion. Well, 6 leaders in the House of Commons approached the Speaker broke out to bring a motion of contempt against the government and to force the government to bring the entire legal opinion. And the debate is taking place sometime tomorrow in the House of Commons. The government of Britain has been a motion of contempt. So on the one hand, Madam President, they tell us that CFATF is saying change the secrecy provision. And when we look at the report, there is no such order. And I want to know if FATF, this big organization, have read, Madam President, what I want to refer to at this time, the Proceeds of Crime Act. Because as my colleague said, in the Proceeds of Crime Act, you cannot get it better. There is a provision, and Madam President, if you will allow me, you know, I'm a Bush lawyer, so I did my research. Madam President, let me tell you what this says, which is very critical here. This is Section 34 of the legislation. Madam President, you will much remember that because you were part of it. Madam President, may I? It is Section 34, subsection 10. Madam President, hear what it says. May I have your complete silence on this one? This is very important. Madam President, it says, material may be produced or disclosed in pursuance of this section, notwithstanding any obligation as to secrecy or other restriction upon the disclosure of information imposed by statute or otherwise. So, Madam President, may I read this slowly for you again?
No need.
Oh, no need. I think you got it. Madam President, it's clear. FATF did not read this. And the government did not guide FATF on this matter. Because already in legislation, they have the power through the courts to go to the Board of Inland Revenue and get production orders to get information on tax crimes. So, Madam President, the question that has to be asked, what is the aim? What is the objective? What is the mission of the government, Madam President? Madam President, you recall some time ago, we dealt with the land bills and property tax bills. There was something called a return form, where you have to fill out how much rooms you have in your house, your telephone, your address, your location, and you have to pass that on to the government through their bureaucrats. The government have data on every citizen in the country. Now the government is using this measure to get into the private affairs of every citizen who pay taxes in this country. That is what this is about. This is not about, Madam President, any demand being made by CFATF or FATF. This is a conditionality that the PNM has imposed on Trinidad and Tobago. And they are using FATF as an excuse, as a front, Madam President. Madam President, I also looked at the report, 2017 annual report of the Financial Intelligence Unit and 2016. And I tried to locate where this unit has been making this demand to invade the sacred grounds of the BIR to get people's data on taxation. I haven't seen it. So where is this thing coming from? If it is not coming from the government, it certainly is not in the reports that the FIU has produced, saying that they want to invade the spaces of the BIR. Because you know why, Madam President, they wouldn't want to do that? They already have the power under Section 16. If they ask for information and they don't get the information, they can go to the court and demand the information. So why do you want to get this open door to go in there, Madam President? Madam President, we can't support bad law. This is bad law. And Madam President, you know what the government is seeking to do? As you know? Well, I shouldn't say you know. What the government is seeking to do, Madam President, is to pass this thing tonight with your majority. Because they have the majority. Hitler had the majority in Parliament. No, what I'm saying, Madam President, I'm not saying that to scare you.
All right, Senator Mark, at this stage, I'm trying to tell you to finesse your language, dial it back a little bit, please. Okay?
You know me, Madam President. Well, your government is a fascist government.
No, please, members, please. Senator Mark, please withdraw that statement and continue.
Fascist yet, but
Senator Mark, without...
All right, Madam President, I'm guided. I withdraw, Madam President. But I will say on the platform that this government is what I've just said. And nobody will be able to stop me on the platform. Nobody. Yes, Madam.
Please take your seat. You're not on a platform here, and I would just ask you to continue in the parliamentary tradition. Continue.
You know, I tease you and thing. You know, we are good friends. No, the president is very good with me. No, well, you are my friend too. So, Madam President, we have very grave concern about the legislation that has been brought before us. The government, as far as we are concerned on this side, have not proven their case, and we are predicting that the bill that we are debating today, that they will pass tonight without our support, that will be struck down in the courts of Trinidad and Tobago as being unconstitutional, will force this government to come back kicking and screaming to this parliament to bring the necessary changes and amendments. Madam President, I want to remind you, Madam President.
Mark, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I want to remind my colleagues, as my friend said earlier, this is not about partisan politics. I think what Senator doing right. This is parliamentary democracy. And what is at stake, Madam President, is our parliamentary democracy. And the government of Trinidad and Tobago is trying to use its majority to pass legislation that they know, Madam President, will not take this country off the non-compliant list. What would have taken this government off the compliant list is if they had listened to the words, the wisdom of the leader of the opposition, the next prime minister of this country, the Honorable Prasad. If they had listened to the honorable leader of the opposition and said, let us take these 3 bills together, we would have completed this matter and this exercise already. They would have gotten our cooperation. The 3 bills would have been debated and passed jointly, and we would have been off the blacklist or any threatened blacklist. Because right now we are told we're on the grey list, according to FATF. And if we don't get this thing right, we're going on the blacklist. That is FATF, Madam President. So as far as we are concerned, we are willing to work as we did with the government on the FATF legislation. We make ourselves available once the government is willing to be open with the opposition, be transparent, don't hide information, release information. There must be full disclosure, Madam President. And Madam President, may I also bring to your attention the credibility crisis as I wind up on this matter. Madam President, I don't know if you are aware that since the government released this memorandum of understanding involving sandals, I looked at section D, 8D. I was shocked.
Senator Mark, please, as you use your last few minutes, please be relevant to the matter at hand.
All right, Madam President. So, Madam President, the government, as I said, has no case. The government has not brought any evidence to convince us that this is necessary. We are not going to be taking part and passing and supporting any legislation that we know to be weak, deficient, and will not achieve the objective. We make ourselves available as the alternative government to meet with the government of Trinidad and Tobago in a joint select committee to deal with the 3 pieces of legislation in a thorough way and get them passed properly and in a proportional way. We are not prepared to support the legislation in its current form in any way. It cannot be fixed. It has to be thrown out. It has to be withdrawn. And we so indicate and so advise. Madam President, as usual, I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few words. Thank you very much.
Senator Thompson-Ahye.
Thank you, Madam President. In 1997, I was arguing very strenuously and vigorously against the passage of new legislation. It was the Community Service Act. And during the coffee break, it was at a symposium at Mount Hope, mounted by Penal Reform International and Alternatives to Custody Group, UNICEF, a number of people were there. And during the coffee break, Chief Justice Rattray of Jamaica at the time came to me and whispered to me, Hazel, the best is the enemy of the good. It is something I never forgot. It hasn't prevented me from arguing against legislation, but I always try to remember that sometimes in striving to get the best law, we may not get any law at all. So sometimes what we have to do is go for the incremental steps. This is an attempt, this law, to honor some international and regional, forgive my voice, struggling with the flu, obligations. But I am more concerned with the potential of this law to change the whole paradigm of how we look at crime. I am not too worried about our being made to comply with legal obligations that are, international. There is nothing wrong with that if we are looking at international standards. Complying with international standards really just show that we are trying to do the right thing many times because it is the right thing to do. The potential of this bill to unearth financial wrongdoing, fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, all types of white-collar crime, and even terrorist financing, terrorist organization is what excites me, the potential. And when I think of what we heard today about the $22 billion that we lose because of all of the ways that people evade taxes and do money laundering, I think about the importance of the money, and that is what resonated most with me, to do what we have to do to fulfill the obligations of the state to those who in Trinidad and Tobago most need it, especially, I must say, the children of this country. So I see this bill as marking in this Advent season the coming of a new dawn of looking at crime as targeting not just the criminals who we see as cockroaches to be crushed, or people who must bite the dust because the sheriff and his essential deputies are in town, but who just can actually change the thinking of the society that this is not one where the rich get richer and the poor get prison. White-collar crime plays havoc in the society with the whole economy. And what is not always readily appreciated, that removes from the coffers of the society so much money that can be used to benefit so many people who have so little. So when we think about how we can do things differently, then we can consider, perhaps, let us put our heads together, as my colleague said, and see what we can do to change this whole paradigm of acting so that many people don't get away with what has been happening in the past. So that we're only talking about following the money, and we have perhaps an instrument, a way of actually following the money. I was in Antigua a couple of years ago, and as I was coming down to the hotel where I was to conduct some training, the taxi driver showed me a number of very elaborate buildings. And he said, you know, these ones belonged to Mr. Sanford. Mr. Sanford, who was convicted in 2009 for massive fraud. And by 2012, it was all over. He had been convicted. And I thought to myself, you know, if that had been in Trinidad, he would still be fighting extradition. He would not be serving the 110 years in prison. White-collar crime helps to perpetrate this structural violence that we have against the poor people, who suffer as a result of the state inability to meet their basic needs, and especially the children. So when we look at who are the real criminals in society, it's not the people we see on television and on those programs who are shooting and killing people, who populate our prisons. Because even sometimes when the corporate crime stares us in the face, we make excuses and we turn a blind eye. The media focuses a lot on street crime, but what is destroying our society to a large extent and preventing the children of enjoying their human rights, the right to life, survival, and development, to good health, especially disabled, to an education to the highest level, to enjoy all the rights, is because sometimes we just can't afford to give them what they're entitled to. And how we treat with people who commit big crimes as against those who commit other crimes. Point also to discrimination against children. So when the children look and they see that someone who has, in fact, brought false papers and gotten a job and hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Treasury, and we say, oh, you know, he has already suffered because he has brought shame on his family. But the child who falsifies a certificate and changes a grade from a D to a C, that child is hauled before the courts. So maybe what we're doing here is having a new way of dealing with things. Because when we do not treat with the big criminals, because corporate crime is a form of murder sometimes, when you see that you can't get good health care because the money has gone elsewhere, that's a form of murder. But we don't look at it that way. We don't view it that way because that's not how we were trained. We were trained to look at crime as what we see in the streets, those that bring fear. But the real criminals, man, they could be getting all kinds of awards, all kinds of big honors, because we don't regard them as criminals. And it's time we change that. And this bill, as I see it, is giving us another weapon in our arsenal to try to fight crime in another way. So let us use what we have. Again, I quote of blessed memory, Chief Justice Rattray, his words to me, "The best is the enemy of the good." so that we have to recognize that corporate crime is widespread. Few are held responsible. Let us see what we can do to make those who got a bly or who got a free pass in the past actually come before the court. Sometimes we have to take some medicine that don't taste so good. We all know what we went through as children. Sometimes we have to make sacrifices of the things that are dear to us. But if it is for the greater good, can't we do it? If it is for the next generation, can't we make that sacrifice? The chief problem, W.E.B. Du Bois said, in any community cursed with crime is not punishment of the criminals, you know, but the prevention of the young from being trained to crime. So the young are looking on, they're watching, and they're learning from us. Children don't come out of the womb committing crimes, you know. We teach them, and then we condemn them. Another thing that Du Bois said is, we must be conscious of how we view ourselves and how the world views us. How does the world view us, Trinidad and Tobago? We were the leaders in the Caribbean once upon a time. We think we still are, but we're not. We are behind in many ways. But I still have hope. As I said last week, I still have hope. I have hope that we are going to do the right thing. I have hope that we are going to obey the international obligations and the regional obligations. Even one that seems so simple to me, but we can't get it done yet, Mr. Attorney General, Madam President, to change the age of criminal responsibility. The law is in the Caribbean. I'm ashamed. And also, I have hope that at the end of the day, we are capable of turning this country around. So, we look at who are the biggest criminals. We focus on crime in its corporate context, and we must not restrict it to the localized street version of crime. And if I may, I want to quote Jim Considine, the Catholic priest from New Zealand who introduced me to restorative justice in 1999, and in 2001 trained me to how to conduct a conference. And he said, what is real crime and who are the biggest criminals? Until we start to focus on crime in its global corporate context and not restrict ourselves merely to the localized street version, we will never learn to identify and grapple with some of the biggest criminals in our society. And we will never create a society where the common good is achieved, where people are truly respected for who they are, where true justice prevails. And that's all I want. That's all we should all want, justice. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Hussain.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam President, for giving me this opportunity to contribute to this debate on the Income Tax Amendment Bill of 2018. And, Madam President, when we look at this bill that was laid in this Parliament since the 25th of May 2018, it has come a long way from then. A joint select committee was appointed to consider this bill together with two other bills, which is the Convention and the Tax Information Exchange Agreement Bill. I would not touch on those because of the standing orders with regards to anticipation, Madam President. And these bills were laid in this Parliament in order for Trinidad and Tobago to attempt to become compliant with our international obligations for two different organizations. The first being that of the Global Forum, and the second, the Financial Action Task Force requirements. And Madam President, I'll focus on the Global Forum requirements first. Now, Global Forum assesses countries on two phases. And the reason that we have to be compliant is so that we can share tax information so that persons cannot avoid paying taxes in various jurisdictions. So they conduct assessments on two phases. The first phase deals with an examination of the legal and the regulatory framework of a country. And then the second phase deals with looking into the implementation of that framework, and it will now rate countries as compliant, as largely compliant, partially compliant, or non-compliant. And Madam President, Trinidad and Tobago, many persons did not speak of this, but Trinidad and Tobago underwent the Phase 1 evaluation on the 1st of March 2010. And I get this information from the peer review Phase 1 report, Trinidad and Tobago OECD 2011 at page 9. And Madam President, it was a PNM government who was in power at that time. And Global Forum sent a questionnaire for that government to complete. And that questionnaire was due on the 29th of March 2010. And that government failed to complete the questionnaire so that Trinidad and Tobago can be evaluated. It took a People's Partnership government to respond to the questionnaire on the 27th of July 2010, almost 2 months after gaining power, 1 month, probably 1 to 2 months after gaining power in Trinidad and Tobago. And Trinidad and Tobago at that point in time was not a member of the Global Forum when the Phase 1 evaluation was completed. 2011, yes, a cabinet decision was taken for Trinidad and Tobago to join the Global Forum. But it was not until 2014 when then Minister of Finance, Larry Howey, would have committed Trinidad and Tobago to the Global Forum for increased tax transparency. And Madam President, he gave a timeline. He didn't say that it was going to happen in 2015. He didn't say it was going to happen in 2016. He said it will happen by 2017, giving Trinidad and Tobago enough time to put the various legal and regulatory framework in place so that information can be shared at that point in time, which was June 2017. We fast forward. So we were deemed to be non-compliant, Madam President, since the 28th of June 2017. So that's the first part. We were deemed non-compliant since then. It was almost as a blacklist by the OECD. And then Trinidad and Tobago, under this PNM government, underwent something called a fast-track review in 2016. Now, this fast-track review, Madam President, what it is, countries who want to sign the convention, they will ask the Global Forum before the stated deadline. You can do a fast-track before that, Madam President, so that they can look at the legal framework that you would have put in place so that you can be deemed somewhat compliant before you sign the convention. Yes, I can. The Global Forum and its plenary on the 2nd to the 4th of November 2016 agreed to adopt the fast track. That was the plenary agreeing. And then Trinidad and Tobago also underwent fast track. We underwent fast track, Madam President, without putting a single law in place. We underwent fast track without putting a single law in place, Madam President. Not a single law. And Madam President, the Attorney General is saying that we didn't participate in the fast track, but there are reports coming out of the OECD that suggest that Trinidad and Tobago underwent fast track evaluation without a single law. The Minister of Finance, Madam President, the Minister of Finance, he said in the other place that Trinidad and Tobago underwent fast track in an attempt to sign the convention on the tax matters bill, Madam President. So I can't understand now that the story is changing, just like the deadline. Just like the deadline. And Madam President, when you look at this bill, when it was first laid on the 25th of May 2018, the bill has morphed, Madam President. The bill had probably some good intentions then and when it came out of the JSC based on the recommendations by the opposition. But you know what this bill morphed into, Madam President? A political tool. A political tool for political witch hunt. Because you know why, Madam President? This is an election year. This is an election year. So you're putting your arsenal in place.
Senator Hussain, your contribution is now morphing into what has been said by two previous members of the opposition bench. So there is something called tedious repetition, and I'm going to ask you, if, in making your contribution, to really not go over that again, to make new points, okay?
Thank you very much for your guidance, Madam President, and I will be so guided. And Madam President, when you look at some of the comments that was made during the crosstalk, my colleague Senator Mark would have indicated that had the government listened to the proposition or the comments or the advice given by the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, Trinidad and Tobago would have been out of the blacklist. And I want to endorse that statement because from 2010 to 2015, Trinidad and Tobago was never blacklisted. You know why, Madam President? There was proper leadership. There was proper leadership in the governance in that last government. But let's look at some deadlines, Madam President, because there's a shifting of the deadline, and as the Prime Minister called it, it's a moving pavement, Madam President, a moving pavement. So let's look at some deadlines, Madam President. So we heard first deadline, September 2017. We heard the next deadline, September 2018. Next deadline, November 2018. But then we have letters, Madam President, where the deadline for Global Forum is December 2018. And there's a letter here from Brussels, Madam President, dated the 23rd of October 2017. And this letter, Madam President, was signed by Fabrizia Lapocarella. And she said in this letter, Madam President, and I'll quote, "The Code of Conduct Group, which is the EU group, the OECD group, will not recommend to the Council of the EU to include in the list of non-cooperative jurisdictions for tax purposes any country or jurisdictions which commit to correct the identified deficiencies by 31 December 2018 at the latest." That letter that came from Brussels, Madam President, the Minister of Finance responded to that letter. And by letter dated 21 November 2017, under the hand of the Minister of Finance, the Honourable Colm Imbert, to the chair of the Code of Conduct Group, he said, Madam President, and if you allow me to quote, "I acknowledge that the Code of Conduct Group will not recommend Trinidad and Tobago to be listed as a non-cooperative tax jurisdiction by the Council of the EU, provided that Trinidad and Tobago commits to address its deficiencies by 31 December 2018. The Minister of Finance committed, Madam President, to ensure that the deficiencies are taken care of or met by 31 December 2018. So where this September, November deadline came from? The sky will fall, Madam President, we heard it. Well, the deadline gone. Friday was the deadline that this government gave. Today is the 4th of December. The time has gone. Has the sky fallen, Madam President? Did we lose correspondent banking? No, Madam President. Again, this government is only engaged in mamagaing. Mamagaing the Parliament and mamagaing the population, Madam President. And, Madam President, to show how lax this government is, Minister Imbert in his letter also proposed a timeline for the passage of certain pieces of legislation. And he committed that Trinidad and Tobago, this is under his hand, would have passed the Income Tax Amendment Bill 2017 by June 30th, 2018. 6 months have gone. 6 months have gone, and you have not properly addressed the issues in this bill. And what do you bring to this Parliament? A truncated, chop-up, slaughtered, butchered version of the bill. Just like Petrotrin. Just like Petrotrin. But then you look at what the ambassador had to say about this matter, Madam President, regarding the deadline. And he said, when you listen to the Special Select Committee, he said,
I have to caution you, Senator Hussein. We have a bill before this chamber, okay? So, Special Select Committee of the other place, go cautiously, because a lot of that is not going to be relevant to what we are dealing with today, okay?
I'm guided, Madam President, but I took copious notes. I looked at the Special Select Committee while I was home on ParlView. And then I was listening to on the radio. And the ambassador had this to say that there's no specific deadlines. So who is really telling the truth, Madam President? Who is really telling the truth? Who is telling the truth in this place? It clearly cannot be the government, because there are documents, there are utterances to prove that the government is not being truthful with the population with regards to the deadline for our compliance with Global Forum. And then we must look at how we ended up on this blacklist, Madam President, because Trinidad and Tobago is blacklisted. And we have been so since June last year. Come again in the EU, December 5th last year. You know what we were? Blacklisted again by the EU, Madam President. So there are two areas in which Trinidad and Tobago were blacklisted. First, OECD, June. Then you come EU, December 2017, Madam President. All under this government. The embarrassment that they have placed Trinidad and Tobago in, and now forcing the opposition, forcing a bill down our throat, an unconstitutional piece of law for us to support. We will not support such legislation, Madam President. We will not support it. We will not support it. But then the AG spoke about a grey list, and that Trinidad and Tobago is on a grey list. Some grey list he's speaking about with regards to FATF. Well, Madam President, I have an article from, this article is from the Newsday, Madam President, dated the 7th of November 2017. And you know what it says, Madam President? AG, TT, not grey listed by FATF. And Madam President, when you read this article, you know what the AG said? There is no concept of grey listing in the 4th round of FATF evaluation. Trinidad and Tobago is in 4th round. Being an enhanced follow-up is not grey listing because grey listing applies to the 3rd round of mutual evaluation, not the 4th. So what list are we on? Because if we're in 4th round evaluation, then how can we be on a grey list? Madam President, that simply cannot be true. This is the word. These are the words of the Attorney General. This is what the Attorney General has been quoted as saying in a press briefing at his own ministry building in Port of Spain, Madam President. And these are the kinds of inconsistencies. This is the misinformation that comes out of the government and creates confusion in the population. But we as the opposition, we have to distill that confusion, Madam President, and present the facts to the population so that they will actually know what is happening with the affairs of this country under the leadership of this Prime Minister and this Attorney General, Madam President. Then we move on to sanctions, Madam President, because this is the next area that they spoke of. Sanctions. If we don't pass this bill, lose correspondent banking, the sky will fall. We would not have really no transfers with Western Union. I even heard the Minister of Finance talk about you can't buy nothing on JCPenney with your credit card, all of these things.
Senator Hosein, you're starting to repeat yourself in your presentation. A little while before, you spoke about sanctions and correspondent banking. You mentioned all of that before. Are you taking a different angle now? You sure? Because it doesn't sound so to me. And I just want to caution you on tedious repetition.
Madam President, if you will just allow me, Madam President.
I have been allowing you, Senator Hosein.
Thank you very much. I agree. And Madam President, when you look at some of the functions of the Global Forum, Madam President, do you know that the Global Forum has no power to sanction any country? And that is the point I want to make, Madam President. It is the individual EU countries that makes that decision in order to sanction countries. And you know where I got this information from, Madam President? Not Wikipedia. I got it from the OECD website. And these are council decisions taken by the European Union in order for individual member states to, for defensive measures to be applied to non-compliant states. So it is not that Global Forum is imposing any sanctions on any country. And I'm hearing the size on that side, Madam President. Right? I'm hearing the size. Because I have documents to prove what I say, Madam President, not utterances. Not utterances.
Very good, very good.
And you would see a lot have been said, Madam President, with respect to the production orders. And I don't want to go too much into it because, again, you warned me of issues of tedious repetition. And I take your guidance very seriously, Madam President. I really do. But I want to say, Madam President, that when you look at the stakeholders, let us examine how this judicial oversight provision came into the bill. It was based on the minority report that was filed and appended to the draft final report of the JSC. The government, they looked at the recommendations made by the opposition, and I must say that they included the provisions for judicial oversight not satisfactorily, but they did. And Madam President, when you look at the comments coming out from BAT, AmCham, all of these stakeholders, they agreed that this level of protection must be included. So it shows that it was a very noble and valid amendment made to the bill. And the BIR even went a step further, because when you examine the bill, Madam President, it is an inspector, a police officer above the rank of inspector, who would be the one making the application to the court in order to get certain persons' taxpayers' information. What the BIR had to say, they said that, yes, they have the production orders, it works well. But if you want to include this provision, you should even raise the rank higher to let the Commissioner of Police be the one making the application. Now, I would have heard that the Attorney General would have spoken of the practicality of putting the Commissioner of Police as the applicant in these production orders, Madam President. So those are the issues I raise with respect to the amendment in terms of the powers of the police. But when you look at the CFATF report, the mutual evaluation report, the fourth round mutual evaluation report, they gave some figures, Madam President, and they said that this was the 2016 report, that there are 69 applications for production orders which were granted by the court already. The application consisted of 115 orders that were served on financial institutions and listed businesses. So, Madam President, the BIR also admitted that the production orders work well. The police have been able to access taxpayers' information from the BIR. The BIR also admitted the same, police admitted the same. So then, what is the purpose of this amendment? It's otious, Madam President. Again, a mama guy. Mama guy in the population trying to probably mama guy who we have to satisfy in terms of our international obligations. But that is just one of the improvement that came out of the bill. That is just one. So can you imagine, Madam President, if the bill was referred back in the JSC as we had asked for it to be, we would have had 3 comprehensive pieces of legislation to lay before this Parliament, so that Trinidad and Tobago would have really stood a fighting chance of coming out of the blacklist. Yeah. What is the fear? What is the issue of putting back the bill before the JSC? There is none, Madam President. There is none. Why are you afraid? Why is the government so afraid of doing that? Now they have to come next year with some more amendments to the income tax bill, increase Parliament time, increase resources for us to pass the bill so that Trinidad and Tobago can come out of the blacklist. And, Madam President, when you look at the JSC again, and the work that was done by the JSC, if you have a fear that the work would not be done, the JSC met 3 times, Madam President.
Senator Hussain, I have spoken to you about this reference to the JSC. I spoke to you before about the Special Select Committee. It still applies. What we have here now is a bill, and so deal with the bill that is before us. Don't talk about the Joint Select Committee or the Special Select Committee. You need to be a little more specific, okay?
Thank you very much, Madam President. And Madam President, when you look at the bill directly, there are certain provisions that were deleted from the bill in its original form.
And therefore, what is not in the bill is therefore not relevant to the debate. So you can't introduce what is not in the bill here. That will not make it relevant. It's not relevant.
Madam President, I'm just only responding to the comments that were made by the Attorney General, because he had an opportunity during the piloting of the bill to let the Senate know what was removed from what was retained in the bill, Madam President. So I would ask you to allow me.
Senator Hussain, I have given you some guidance. You can choose it. You can choose to accept the guidance. You know what you have to do, and I know what I have to do. So continue.
Thank you very much. I will move on, Madam President, because I would not get into that issue. But, Madam President, let's look at the bill in terms of the additional offenses, apart from the proceeds of crime and the Anti-Terrorism Act. And you look at offenses of fraud and offenses of dishonesty. Now, these offenses are very wide, Madam President. And no definition with respect to dishonesty were given, none with fraud. But they are common law definitions. And recently there was a case, Ivy against Genting Casinos, 2017, UK Supreme Court 67. That is the citation of the case, Madam President. And it is a landmark case from the UK Supreme Court that clarified the test of what will qualify as dishonesty under criminal law, Madam President. And there was a case before called R against Gosh. And that case would have laid out the test of what would amount to dishonesty. And when you look at the test, Madam President, there's, if you allow me to quote from the Gosh case, the test would have been, the conduct in question of a person must be dishonest by the standards of an ordinary and honest individual. Now that is an objective limb. But then the test went on to give a subjective limb. And the accused must have realized that their conduct, personal conduct, was dishonest by those standards. Now what the UK Supreme Court tried to do, Madam President, is that they modified the test. So they modified the test of dishonesty. And they modified it to create two objective limbs. And the first objective limb remains the same, was the accused dishonest by the standards of an ordinary individual, reasonable individual. And the second limb now is whether or not the accused viewed their action as dishonest by those standards. And the reason I raise this point, Madam President, is because how wide this definition is in terms of how the extent that the common law can drag offenses of dishonesty and fraud, Madam President. And if we really want to pass certain proportional legislation, I think a definition should have been added for what amounts to dishonesty and what would have also amounted to fraud cases, Madam President, because it is extremely wide. Very, very wide and broad, Madam President. And it can lead to a lot of ambiguity, and it will waste a lot of court time to determine whether or not an offense qualifies under fraud or dishonesty in the court, because there will be arguments from the prosecution and the defense, which will take up a lot of judicial time. So why not just make the legislation as certain as possible at this stage in time? And if you would permit me also, Madam President, I listened to the Minister of Finance, the Minister in the Ministry of Finance, when she gave her contribution. And her contribution, in my respectful view, Madam President, was not relevant to the bill before the Senate. And the reason I say that is because the Minister went on to talk about base erosion and shifting of profits. That is the subject of another bill, Madam President, a bill that has not seen this Parliament as yet, but Trinidad and Tobago has committed to pass its bill. She spoke of the police wants this legislation. She spoke of, I believe, the bill is not the BIR because they had a different view, but the police want the legislation. You know what the police also wanted, Madam President? Anti-gang. And look at how that ended up. Exactly. But I don't expect much, Madam President, because if the Minister's contribution came from Wikipedia, that will be the standard in which the contribution will be, Madam President. Wikipedia. You have all the state resources at your disposal, but you're quoting from Wikipedia. And Madam President, yes, Madam President. And the Attorney General would have raised some other points with regard in his contribution. And Madam President, the Attorney General said that we agreed to take out one bill from the JSC. Well, that is misleading the Senate, Madam President, because we have never, myself, MP Charles, MP Karim.
So you know that when you say, Senator Hussein, that someone, a member of a minister or a member of Parliament is misleading the Senate, you do know that is imputing improper motives. So please find a different way, apologize, withdraw that statement, and present your arguments a different way, please.
Withdraw, Madam President, but the Attorney General would have misrepresented the views of the opposition.
Senator Hussein, please. Please.
Well, Madam President, I withdraw. But we never, in the three opposition members, according to the Attorney General, we never agreed to take out one bill from the JSC. What we agreed to, Madam President, is the fact that if you can provide us with the evidence that the passage of the income tax bill alone will take us off from the blacklist, we will agree. Do you know, Madam President?
Senator Hussein, please take your seat. I have cautioned you repeatedly on your presentation and during your presentation, and you are still ignoring what I have pointed you to. So I am now going to call on the next speaker. Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Madam President, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to join the debate on this very important bill. Madam President, I understand the problem my friends on the other side face. They wish to debate a bill that is not before us, relying in that debate on material that is not relevant to us, and supporting their debate on arguments that are not necessary. And I apologize to you, Madam President, on this distress that has been caused. I found my contribution, Madam President, in a contribution from former Attorney General Anand Ramlogan. And I hope my friends find comfort in it. There is no better contribution to go and read to understand the importance of this bill than Ramlogan's contribution, Friday, August 17, 2012. And the then Attorney General was contributing to the FIU of Trinidad and Tobago and the Anti-Terrorism Bill 2012. And these are the magical words for my friends. Put it in your vocabulary. Ramlogan spoke, Madam President, of the non-restrictive nature of the legislation that he had been putting forward. The overreach. Because if you are going to fight a global problem, you are going to overreach. And that is what every piece of legislation, my friend Senator Ramdeen was talking about, we have to come back next year. We have to come back before Christmas, we have to come back with legislation dealing with FIU and so on. Because this is not something that is cast in stone. Our commitments to the global community are commitments that are evolving. With every evaluation of a country other than Trinidad and Tobago, we'll be called upon to make changes. And as I've said in previous debates on this issue of sovereignty, you could hold on to your red, white, and black sovereignty. But if this country must function in the global financial system, we better find ourselves falling in line. And Senator Ramlogan, as he was then, talked about overreach. He talked about expansion. He talked about reciprocity. Because we have had legislation here, we've had bills here dealing with compliance with what is required of us to function in the global community, for example, FATCA. And we have had to fight on the issue of reciprocity. He used the word collaboration, because you could stand in defense of your Section 4 and Section 5, and you could stand in defense of your constitutional rights. But we have to cede ground, and every piece of legislation that comes requires some level of interference. Because if we are going to fight together, we have to share information, and we have to cede ground. And the last one is this issue of compliance. And I have listened to creating confusion in the public mind. That is something I kept hearing for the contribution so far. I think the confusion is being created in the mind of the opposition. The public is on board. The public knows what has to be done. And there's no confusion in their mind. We have to do certain things if we must comply, and if we must continue to be allowed to play. And that is what this bill is about. This bill is just another step. It's nothing new Senator Ram Logan, as he was then traced, he was talking and he talked about all the amendments made to FIU and anti-terrorism and so on. And notwithstanding all those amendments, we still had to come back to this House with brand new anti-terrorism legislation and meet the same level of opposition and disinterest and lack of knowledge and so on. So this is about furthering work that you were part of. And for you to come now and change your tone and bring the most frivolous arguments I've heard and irrelevant arguments and frustrating. The most frustrating set of arguments. And the JSC. I was part of the JSC, Madam President.
Minister, please.
I am not going.
Yeah, okay.
I am not going to the JSC, but this bill is a product of the collaboration between ourselves and the opposition and the independent. And there's no question in my mind that we took a decision to advance the work on one bill. It's there in the minutes. It's there in the minutes of the meeting. This bill is a product of the work of people on both sides here. And it is not to come here and quarrel and try to rewrite the minutes of the JSC. That decision was taken to advance one because, Madam President, I keep hearing about the three bills, and I want to bring the three. My mother still has a preschool. It's in the 40-something year. And she was my first school teacher. And we learned to count 1, 2, 3. So to get to the three bills you want, we have to start with 1.
No, that's what
and I think the country understands that. That if we get into 3, we'll get to 1, and this is the 1. This is the 1. And it's here before you. It is here before you. So deal with it.
We deal with it already, man. You deal with it.
It is here before you. This is 1. And you'll get to 2. And then you'll get to 3. Yeah. Deal with it. I have listened about this JSC. I was there. I understood. I listened to Senator Ramlin very carefully. I was very pleased that he listed me among the lawyers in this cabinet. Always. I was listed, and I listened very carefully, and I was waiting for the point, and it never came. What's the value of that? All the documents, the documentation in support of this legislation. I don't want to use the word JSC and offend you again, Madam President, but the report that was tendered to the House,
that is guidance.
The report that was tendered in the House includes all the material relating to the bill and the minutes properly, the minutes properly record, the minutes contained in that report laid in the other place, properly record.
Minister, please, please, let me try and get this debate on track. Okay? We have a bill here. Yes, reference was made to the JSC, but I do not want the focus to be on the JSC. Okay, please let the focus be on the bill at hand.
Thank you, Madam President. And this bill, as I recall, involved the work of the technocrats who normally support the Office of the Attorney General. So I don't know that I want to attack the work of the technocrats because I can't believe that when Senator Ram Logan stood up on April 17, 2012, he presented the work of different technocrats. The bill is not the product of the lawyers sitting, the lawyers who sit in the cabinet sit as members of the cabinet. But the documents record, Madam President, it's there, available for perusal, that substantial work is done by technocrats. And I do not want to leave on the record any stain or any question mark over their work. If we as politicians can't make use of their work, I don't think that we should be questioning the quality of their work. And I listened to Senator Ramdeen in the usual way, because today we've had Petrotrin, we've had all kinds of things. So I've been sifting, worse than Makafushe, sifting to find. And Senator Ramdeen talks about, this is 2012 legislation that I referred to, 2012. How many prosecutions came out of the previous work, the work of former Attorney General Anand Ramlogan? How many prosecutions? Because today I heard about prosecution. How many arrests came out of that? No time it was, we talked about money laundering and crime and all of that. How much big fish we got between 10 and 15? Or even how much small fish? I know we had a state of emergency with hundreds and hundreds of people, right? But how much? I mean, I have always said, even on the anti-gang, I said, our work, the work of the legislators, will only go so far. There's important work that we have to do. We have to give them the tools to work with. Unfortunately, not many of us or any of us in here could force them to work or manage their work or oversee their work. But we have to give them the tools. And continuously, administrations have been coming to the Parliament to improve the tools that we give them. But from 2010 to 2015, there's no prosecutions of none. I don't even need to put a condition of big ones or small. There's none. But we would like to continue to give law enforcement the tools that they have to work with. And that is what we're doing in this bill. And this bill is not complicated, Madam President. I listened to my friends talking about starting off with, to the extent that the bill is a waste of time. But when you look to the provisions of the bill, for example, Section 4 of the bill, when you look to provisions of the bill, you understand that the government continues to strengthen the legislation. And you can't criticize us for not doing exactly what we wanted to do. We set out to. The bill we presented in the other place set out to do much more than we have before us now. And I don't need to tell you what happened there. But we've brought to this House a bill that would do some of the things we would like it to do. For example, I listened to the contributions. You want to take ownership of the bill, and you want to discard the bill. So we are not arguing. The decision to make the amendment to include the coverage of the person of the rank of superintendent and so on, and the judicial oversight, we included that on account of the contribution of the opposition. That is not in debate, but you can't rubbish the bill and then lay claim for part of the bill. Make up your mind, because I'm dizzy trying to follow your argument. And we accept that. We accept your argument that maybe it was not the appropriate thing to have any police officer have the opportunity to access that type of information. Senator Hossain is not here, so I wouldn't go into the any doubles vendor story. That is, but we are grateful, and the bill contains a provision for a taxpayer to provide information to a member of the police officer of the rank of superintendent or above, and so on and so forth. The bill also provides that where the taxpayer has disclosed information under the section, the information may be used as evidence in any proceedings in respect of the offense for which the information was accessed. The bill introduces at Clause 5 restrictions on the use of taxpayer information. So the bill introduces Section 4A. Where taxpayer information has been provided, it could only be used for the information for which it was provided. It could only be retained for as long as is necessary for the purpose collected, and the information must not be disclosed for purposes other than the purpose for which it was collected without the prior consent of the BIR. And 4B is introduced, creating offenses for breaches of the section. So anybody who receives taxpayer information under Section 4
I think everyone here has a copy of the bill before them. So you can talk about the clause and just expand on what you think will be the effect, but you don't need to read out the entire clause.
Madam President, thank you. I labored under the view that the opposition had not read the bill. And reinforced by your assurance. Reinforced by your assurance. Reinforced by your assurance, Madam President, that they have in fact read the bill. I will continue. But Madam President, it's very important that in accessing information, that we also ensure that the appropriate protection is in place. And this bill is not a waste of time. It creates offenses for which there are significant penalties, including a fine of $300,000 and a fine of $500,000 if there is a breach of that protection. Madam President, I heard the word abracadabra from Senator Ramdeen. And I want to say, going back to Senator Ramlogan as he then was in 2012, that this legislation fits into a very complex global requirement. Yes, I told you that from the start. I'm rooting my contribution in the contribution of Ramlogan. And Madam President, this is important work for Trinidad and Tobago to continue in the global financial environment. It is not exactly what we would have liked to have, but it will go towards strengthening our ability and giving law enforcement more tools. And we are very happy to bring it here. We look forward to the support of our friends on the other side, and I thank you very much.
Senator Vieira.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, I'd like to apologize to Senator Richards and my colleagues on the independent bench, because after indicating that I would not speak after hearing the contributions, I felt compelled to say a few words.
Always have the option to speak.
As George Bernard Shaw said, progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. Anyway, these are some of the thoughts and questions that are running through my mind in respect of this bill. Where are we as a country? And where do we as a country need to be internally and externally? What is the purpose of this legislation? Is it necessary? Does it pose a risk to citizens? What happens if it's not passed? So I'll try and deal with each of these in turn. Now, where are we as a country? Madam President, we are a country ravaged by crime and the effects of criminal activity. And while efforts have been made at getting certain perpetrators, by and large, our success has been limited and really at a low level, not getting at the big fish. The big fish always seem able to distance themselves from the hands-on activities of crime, the transporting of the drugs and illicit goods, the violent acts. But tracking the money, the commercial aspects of crime, the profits of crime, that's how you go behind the big fish. That's how you catch the big fish. And that is one of the objects of the bill. Now, where do we need to be as a country? Internally, we need to clamp down on all criminal activity, not only those who carry out the criminal conduct, but those who benefit from criminal conduct and engage in criminal business. As Senator Rambharat pointed out, this is not a bill in isolation. It forms a package, an omnibus set of related laws, Proceeds of Crime Act, Anti-Terrorism Act, Financial Regulations Obligations, Financial Obligation Regulations. So this bill is targeting those who engage in criminal business for gain and profit, organized crime, white-collar crime, unexplained wealth. How is it that the money launderers and money laundering takes place hidden in plain view and nobody is held to account? So I think I will support this legislation because this is one of the tools in the toolkit that will go behind that type of activity. And externally, why do we need to support this bill? As we have heard, this, if we don't do something about it, it will compromise our country's business climate. There is a perception that this country is high risk. There is a real risk of de-risking banks. Let us not forget that in 1990, we were the first country in this hemisphere to suffer from a terrorist act, the attempted coup. We also have been put on the radar internationally because of the high numbers of Trinidadians who have signed up with ISIS. So anti-terrorism is a real issue for us. Now, years ago, I practiced in an offshore jurisdiction. And I saw firsthand what can happen if your country is gray or blacklisted. What does blacklisting mean? Blacklisting means you're a country to be avoided. You're a country to be distrusted. You're not acceptable in the Club of Nations. You're a country that refuses to cooperate with the international community. Well, Madam President, as a proud Trinidadian, that is not a designation that I can accept. To be blacklisted is anathema. So, with that experience, for many years, I have been lending my voice, lending my support, whether it's to the Law Association, whether to the FIU, other stakeholders, the chambers, in alerting them about the need to upgrade our laws and to get compliant with international best practice. And I also would like to say, I participated in the 2015 assessment. I was a member of the Law Association's team, and that took place when the opposition was in government. And I want to tell you, that was a very searching, very thorough examination by a panel of experts and neutrals. And they were drilling down. It was not superficial. They wanted to know what you had in place, whether you had the right systems. They really were examining in depth your legal and regulatory framework. So this is not something that is going to be vai-ki-vai. This is not happenstance and something that we could get by on old talk. We have to pass a test. It's going to be a rigorous examination, and we need to get our laws and regulations up to speed. End of story. So, and it's true, we were really, notwithstanding all the best efforts of the Director of Financial Intelligence Unit, and I mean, they were looking at all the listed business activities, the real estate agents, the jewelers, the car, automobile sellers, attorneys at law, accountants. Some sectors were stronger than others, but as a whole, we were not up to speed. And that needs to change. So, what is the purpose of this legislation? Well, the clear answer is to allow law enforcement to share and exchange information about taxes. So this is geared towards unexplained wealth. And a person having official duty shares with the Director of the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago, or with a very senior officer of the police service. Now, what is he sharing? Information required for the purpose of investigating whether an offense has been committed and the identity of the person who may have conducted the offense. Well, I would like to say law-abiding citizens should have no fear of this legislation. I can only think of one person who refuses to disclose his tax returns, and he's in a different jurisdiction. And he does not in any way seem typical of the person taking the priority bus route. And what are the offenses we are talking about? Proceeds of crime, criminal conduct, constitutes an offense in Trinidad and Tobago, or conduct which occurs outside of Trinidad and Tobago and would constitute an offense if it occurred in Trinidad and Tobago. Anti-terrorism. Well, as I said, terrorism is nothing to scoff at. We've had serious instances of terrorist activities. We are on the international community's radar as a terrorist watched jurisdiction. Prevention of Corruption Act, nothing invidious or sinister there. And then, of course, offenses involving fraud or dishonesty. Now, I too was troubled by offenses involving fraud or dishonesty because it seemed vague. But then I thought about it. When you look at these sections, there are situations where the offenses will not be captured. So this phrase, involving fraud or dishonesty, is an attempt, I think, to capture those aspects outside of the Proceeds of Crime Act, the Anti-Terrorism Act, and the Prevention of Corruption Act. Fraud is pretty straightforward. What does dishonesty mean? Dishonesty involves conscious and deliberate wrongdoing. And aspects or instances of dishonesty that I could see falling here: financial sector misconduct, making false or misleading statements, failing to disclose required documents or statements, or providing documents containing false information, misleading statements, or glaring omissions. These are dishonest acts and practices that I think is trying to be picked up here by this legislation. And as I say, there are dishonest practices that can have real impact on citizens, things like counterfeiting. When you start to counterfeit pharmaceuticals, you counterfeit things like batteries and things that could cause life and limb, harm to life and limb. The people who are making profit out of these unlawful activities have to be gone after. Now I turn to the matter of privacy, and this really I want to thank Senator Ramdeen about, because I think it is an important consideration. And it's really, again, the balance between the rights of privacy and the need for proper law enforcement. Privacy is one of the fundamental human rights guaranteed under the Constitution. It is the right of the individual to respect for his private life and family life. I think it's section 4C. Now, we don't have a privacy law in Trinidad and Tobago per se. And so activities that may seem like breach of privacy between the individuals and the private sector, there's no real law capturing that. You have to tackle that under different aspects of the law. But certainly in the public sphere, citizens are assured of respect for their privacy against unauthorized intrusions by the state. And so where privacy is concerned, no law can change without the requisite majority. Now, I did not come here to debate this bill, and I really didn't look at the privacy law aspect. I have not looked at the authorities. I haven't looked at the point in depth, but it is a worry. And it may well be challenged in court, and it may fall to a court to decide whether the AG and those advising him are correct, or whether the opposition are right that this is falling short of the constitutional requirements. But I take a page out of Senator Thompson-Ahye's book. The enemy of the good is the best. We can't strive for perfection. There is a guillotine coming down. Time is of the essence. We have to act. So I prefer to take the chance rather than not do anything. It's incumbent on us to support this legislation. Because I also want to point out, this law will also impact those in government. They too will run the risk of having their taxes disclosed to authorities and others. They're not looking to shield themselves or to bricks for themselves. And so, do we need to support this legislation? Are we compromising our country's business climate? As Senator Dionarine asked, are we upholding our responsibility to the citizenry? I would like to think we in this House will want to tackle the scourge of crime, white-collar and corrupt politicians, corrupt administrators. We want to take our place in the international community as a compliant jurisdiction. I think not passing this legislation allows organized crime and the corrupt a certain leeway. And, of course, the very real risk, the possibility of being blacklisted and sanctions being imposed. I think if we drop the ball here, we would be irresponsible. And with that, Madam President, I thank you.
Senator Obika.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'll begin my contribution today by quoting or paraphrasing the sometimes Attorney General. I believe he acts in the stead of the substantive Attorney General. That is the Member of Parliament for Allyson West, where he said that what the government was seeking to do by this bill is to, and he used the word, water down the secrecy provisions in the legislation. So here we have it. The government, by virtue of the words of one who has acted recently as the Attorney General, has sought to water down.
Would the Honourable Member just give us the source of that quotation, please? Because I don't recall that.
for the benefit of the Attorney General, I would have thought he would have conferred with his subordinate prior to going to the radio station.
Sorry, 46.
Please. Senator Obika, when you're making reference to members of parliament, you do it in a certain way in this chamber. So I would ask you to abide by that, please. And you have attributed saying something to a member of parliament. Can you just say where you heard that, or from yes? No. When you rise, yes, you will say what's the source of that.
Or 1 or 2? All right. So, to prevent the Attorney General from getting jittery and jumping up before I arrive at it, the Member of Parliament for Laventille West was on a morning program on radio station in Trinidad and Tobago, and the radio station's name is Power 102 FM, and he was on the morning program that ends around 9 a.m. So I would invite the Attorney General to confer with his subordinate to confirm or deny.
Just spoken to you about how you speak about members of parliament.
The member of parliament for Laventille.
Please take your seat. When you rise, I would like you to follow the guidance that I'm giving you, please. Okay?
The Member of Parliament for Laventille West. And I want to just tell the government that when they laugh at contributions from members of the opposition, the population is not laughing with them.
The Attorney General is invoking a standing order.
I rise on standing order 46.4 and 46.6. Madam Speaker.
You can't tell me to sit. You can't tell me to sit.
Well, excuse me, Senator Obika. Senator Obika, the Attorney General, as I just pointed out to you, was invoking a standing order. He was not asking you to give way. The practice is when someone invokes a standing order, you have to sit. Okay? Attorney General, I will allow Senator Obika to continue, and I will, so continue, Senator Obika.
I think, Madam President, yes, I'm continuing, and I'm saying that the temporary Senator Young needs to apologize for the comment he just made about school. And once he apologizes, I can continue. I see you have, do you wish me to resume my seat before you pronounce? Madam President? Okay. So I continue. We are accustomed to the PNM badgering the population, so that is okay. All right, so therefore, let me continue, Madam President. And I'm waiting for the AG as he has the standing orders at the handy. Now, as I began, the government has brought this bill to the Parliament. And in the words of the Member of Parliament for Laventille West, they have watered down the secrecy provisions in the bill.
Rise on standing order 46.6. It is that very point that I raised that standing order on for the imputation associated with it.
No. Senator Obika, continue, please.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for your protection, because we don't want to promote any abuses of the standing orders here. So now, what one must also pay attention to when we understand that, in the words of that Member of Parliament, to water down the secrecy provisions. If we turn to the bill before us, Madam President, and we go to section 4, so clause 4 of the bill, I'm not here at your pleasure, Attorney General, so it's not about finally.
Please address me.
Okay,
Members,
Madam President, I'm not here.
Please. Members, please. There's a little crosstalk that can be allowed, and when it is done with good humor. But when it is started now to distract from the business of the chamber, I would ask all members to desist. Continue, Senator Obika.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Addressing you, I'm saying I'm not here at the pleasure of the Attorney General.
Senator Obika, please. Please. I am here, and I am the one who will say when members are not conforming with the standing orders, not you. So please just continue with your presentation, address me, and be focused on the matter at hand.
Yes, so if one turns to that section of the bill that I mentioned, we see where the secrecy rights, the rights to privacy of our citizens are being trespassed. And we ask the question, why? Why is this being done in this way? Now, I have in my possession, Madam President, an article dated the 9th of May 2018, headline, it's from Deloitte, and the title is Luxembourg Tax Alert, Defensive Measures for EU List of Non-Cooperative Countries. Now, there's a particular part of this that I want to get to, and I'll explain why. In piloting this bill, Madam President, the Attorney General solicited a question from one of our distinguished independent senators. I believe it's Dr. Remy. And Dr. Remy's question, I'm not sure if the answer was sufficient to our liking. The question basically was, should we fail to meet the requirements of the Global Forum, of the EU countries in particular, what would be the outcome? And she raised this regarding the clauses of the bill that were removed before coming to this place, Madam President. The Attorney General's response may have shed some light, but I want to sharpen the focus by virtue of this article, all right? And then from there, I will use that as a teaching moment to educate members opposite and the population at large as to what this is about, all right? So, Madam President, I take this contribution very seriously. And just, if I were to take 10 seconds to say why. My background in finance, in particular, coming from an economics background, speaks to the importance of interrelationships in international trade and ease of doing business. So if we were to turn to the third paragraph of this article, there are only 5, Madam President. There's only 5 lines, and I wish to read it verbatim. I thank you. On 8th May 2018, I quote, on 8th May 2018, the Luxembourg direct tax authorities published through a circular the defensive measures, and I will explain what defensive measures are after. The defensive measures in connection with the European list. They intend to examine very closely the transactions of Luxembourg companies with related entities situated in the listed jurisdictions. I want to stick a pin in the words of the Attorney General at this point and explain that word listed. So we are listed in Trinidad and Tobago. The word black may not be part of it, but we are listed in terms of being non-compliant. Consequently, I continue, consequently, the Luxembourg direct tax authorities will carry out an enhanced monitoring of such transactions. So this may seem to be very esoteric to persons listening, because it's the actionable words, Madam President, may escape most persons who are not or familiar with compliance from the perspective of banking. The words are defensive measures, tax authorities, direct tax authorities, and their defensive measures. So defensive measures being the first. Follow closely transactions, the second, action, and the third is enhanced monitoring. Now, when one uses the word enhanced monitoring, Madam President, it brings another word, which is enhanced due diligence. And that is a word that has been trending, if I were to use that phrase, over the past 4 weeks. Why is it trending? What is enhanced due diligence? What does that mean for business in Trinidad and Tobago? I wish to illustrate by virtue of an example. Let's take a very simple example, Madam President. We have a potential investor attracted to Trinidad and Tobago at some trade symposium or some informational video they noticed online. And they decide affordable power, skilled labor force, fair business environment, stable political environment, good governance at times. They would ask the question, okay, let me go to my banker. Let me invest, let's say, in one of the pillars that the government is promoting. So let's say tourism. And they wish to come and invest in Trinidad and Tobago. Before they do so, they go to their banker. And their banker says, oh, this looks like a nice country, let me check. And when that banker goes to their compliance department, Madam President, their compliance department, before they were to engage Trinidad and Tobago directly, they would look to the listed countries, the countries that are compliant versus those that are non-compliant. And they would see, if they were to be in the case of someone from Luxembourg, they would see among the list of jurisdictions, American Samoa, Bahamas, Guam, Namibia, Palau, Samoa, St. Kitts and Nevis, US Virgin Islands, Trinidad and Tobago is listed among them. And it's to be updated annually. But in this particular year, Trinidad and Tobago is listed. And that banker comes back to the client who wishes to invest in Trinidad and tells them that there are some defensive measures we must engage in if you are to do business with Trinidad and Tobago. And that banker, Madam President, would turn to a document, and I wish to state the title for the record. It's dated the 5th of December 2017 from Brussels, Council of the European Union, outcome of proceedings from the General Secretariat of the Council, the subject being the EU list of non-cooperative jurisdictions for tax purposes. Council conclusions adopted on the 5th of December 2017, just 1 year ago, Madam President. And when they turn to a particular page in this document, that is page 18, there are many defensive measures. I won't bore us with all. I would point to just 3. And that banker would see that it says, to ensure coordinated action, member states should apply at least one of the following administrative measures in tax area. A, reinforced monitoring of certain transactions. B, increased audit risks for taxpayers benefiting from regimes at stake. C, increased audit risks for taxpayers using structures or arrangements involving these jurisdictions. Then the banker would tell the client, you'd be subjected to enhanced due diligence. Because the European Union cannot trust that the subsidiary or the operations that you may engage in that country may be shared sufficiently with us to our liking regarding your revenue, your top line, and your bottom line, your tax and your tax payments, to the point where we are not comfortable. So what we will be doing is we'll be checking every transaction. So you want to invest $100 million in that country, we will ask you questions that would take you probably 2 months to answer. Whereas if you were investing in a country that is not listed, you probably may get through that process within a week. That alone may become such a significant deterrent to that investor in Luxembourg that they may choose not to invest in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, so that, I hope that clears the air a little bit for Senator Dr. Remy. It becomes a disincentive to invest. That is enough to negatively affect the work of the Honorable Minister of Trade, who seeks to attract investment, inward investment to Trinidad and Tobago. And why is this important, Madam President? In in December 2017, in this same document, if one were to turn to page 11, the same document from the European Union, it states, and I just want to state here, Trinidad and Tobago has been attributed a rating of non-compliant by the Global Forum, has not signed and ratified the OECD Multilateral Convention, and has a harmful preferential tax regime, and did not commit to addressing these issues by 31st December 2018. Now, this document is December last year. The government has been on the record blaming the opposition. But they had 2 years, Madam President, 2 years since they assumed office, 2 years and some months to address this. They did not. So when we hear Madam Francois from the FIU lamenting that this same enhanced due diligence that I spoke of that may arise, for displaying, from the Luxembourg jurisdiction to inward investment and continued investment in Trinidad and Tobago, this same enhanced due diligence is as a result not of the failure of the government to pass this bill before us, but because of the failure of the government to meet their requirements with Global Forum before and up to December the 5th, 2017, or whichever date they would have listed us as non-compliant. The bottom line, Madam President, is this government must accept the blame for us being non-compliant and also accept the blame for any enhanced due diligence that the Bankers Association are complaining that they are facing today. So I want there was also a comment, Madam President, because I listened attentively, all right? You know, we can laugh and so on, but today is serious business. Today is serious business. I listened attentively, and I was very disappointed that the minister in the Ministry of Finance in my country could cite Wikipedia as a source. I think that should be removed, and the Honorable Minister should correct that for the Hansard if Wikipedia is the final source. Possibly going to find what is the real source, but Wikipedia should not be upheld. Because if you were to look at some of the things that Wikipedia has, Madam President, on institutions that you may be familiar with, you would want to know which organizations they are talking about. Wikipedia must not be referenced as a source. Now, I just want to address, Madam President, something I heard across the floor. The reference was not on Power 102. The reference was the minister who spoke on Power 102. That's the difference. So I just want to, I like to educate. I believe education is important. So I'm happy that I got an opportunity to teach the government senator. So, Madam President, the Honorable Minister, I listened very attentively. The Honorable Minister stated that because the past government committed to Global Forum that Trinidad and Tobago is blacklisted. Madam President, that is totally false. So is it that the minister is saying that, that the past government should not have committed to Global Forum so that Trinidad and Tobago could become a pariah state? Is that what the Honorable Minister, I know that is not what the Honorable Minister was hoping to be the thrust of our contribution. So I really hope that the Minister owns up to the government's failure, because the Minister of Finance has been trumpeting the fact that we belong to a global village. It's being increasingly interconnected. So I know the minister would have expected, regardless of which government is in power, whichever initials they have at the beginning of the name, ABC, CND, doesn't matter. Once you're in government and you are faced with a responsible decision, the responsible decision was to commit your country. So that deals with that point there. Now, Madam President, enhanced due diligence. And this bill speaks specifically to that. And there's something that I want to thank the Bankers Association for, because when you look at the media reports, you think that the Bankers Association were actually against the opposition. But if you listen to one particular person, and he's the chair of the legal authority, the legal committee, I think, in the Bankers Association, the Bankers Association basically have said that they want the judicial oversight. They want it. And I think this country owes a debt of gratitude to the leader of the opposition, Mrs. Kamala Persad-Bissessar, and all the members of the United National Congress for ensuring that that becomes part of this bill. The only sad part, though, is that the FIU remains without the requirement for this judicial oversight. So that is a sad part there. But I know that there may be persons who would challenge that in the courts of our nation. Now, Madam President, I want to leave with this point, this final point. And this point has to do with where we are as a nation. It must not be, I want to start back that sentence. If it were that because of geopolitics we were making this decision, I would have made that the centerpiece of my contribution today. But it is not. Because if we were to take the dictates or the requirements of Global Forum, we would see that really and truly what this bill calls for is not consistent with what they have requested. We would see that they are totally at sea from each other, Madam President. So I want to leave with this point. When the government wants to get particular actions in play, they should just come out and say so. Just come and say so. And we, the opposition, will consider your position. We will consider it from a point of the rights of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. And if you believe that it doesn't sit with the rights of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, we would not accept. We would help you to create good law. But this bill, as it stands, does not meet the objectives of the Global Forum in the fullest extent that they wish to do. And I don't believe necessarily that it may be expedient to say that the enemy in this case, the enemy of, this is the enemy of the best. I'm not sure that this is good in the first case. If it were good, then we can say that it's opposed to being the best. So the enemy of the best is good and that kind of thing. But if however, this bill was well-intentioned, if this bill was well-crafted, and if this bill met the requirements of the Global Forum, I just want to assure the people of Trinidad and Tobago that correspondent banking transactions aren't going to change at the snap of a finger. The European Union member countries are not required to follow directly with the defensive measures. They can cherry pick. They can decide which measures they are going to institute. All of that is in the document that I cited from the European Union, Madam President. They can pick based on their perception of how upfront, how transparent, and how efficient your financial markets are. And they are not going to take decisions just like that to end the correspondent banking transaction relationships of a nation such as Trinidad and Tobago. All right? And I want to leave with these last words, Madam President. The ambassador stated that correspondent banking transactions, when we met with them on this particular issue from the opposition office, this has nothing to do with the Joint Select Committee. When we met with them and we asked a specific question, when or if correspondent banking transactions will be affected and when. To the first question, if, they said that is a question for the member countries. And regards to when, the first answer covers that. So it becomes very difficult, knowing that information, to hear the government saying that correspondent banking relationships will collapse overnight, because they could not have gotten that from the same source as we, and the only source they could have gotten it from is the same source as we. So therefore, I want to correct the record, and I want to tell the Bankers Association that we are on their side. As they have seen, we understand the importance and the negative potential impact of enhanced due diligence, but we want to say that their accusations are pointed in the wrong direction. It should be at the government, because it is under their mismanagement of the situation, failure to bring the correct legislation in front of the Parliament in the appointed time, that we have become non-compliant and that they are facing this enhanced due diligence. With that, I thank you.
Senator Deyalsingh.
Thank you, Madam President, for allowing me to have an input in the Income Tax Bill 2018. I would like to thank the Attorney General for giving us a little history behind the bill, bringing it forward, how it has reached to this stage. And I must say I have two concerns with this bill. The potential for abuse by police, because we have to look at the situation that exists in Trinidad and Tobago, the reality Senator Mark mentioned about the cause of probably political interference. And I guess we also have to factor in that that is a reality that may exist in our country. And we would have to see if somehow we could get safeguards that can come into place. Probably the Minister of National Security, the Commissioner of Police could give some sort of confidence or some sort of safeguards that the individual person may not have that fear that they will be victims of any sort of police interference. So safeguards, level of confidence has to be coming to this place. The other fact I look at is the dilemma I now face, after hearing about the amount of legal minds on the government side and also on the opposition side, hearing about the two authorities, the legal authorities, Surat or even Bank Millet. Which one do we believe in? Do we believe in Surat, that the AG seems to have benefited from in his discourse, trying to get the 3/5, the bill coming into play without the 3/5 majority being required? Or do we believe Bank Millet, as Senator Ramdean suggested? So if the AG saw the need to go with Surat, probably it was due to the desire to fulfill the timeline of the global forum. But the dilemma I face is that if we support this, would we be accused of putting in bad law into the legislation? So this is the little dilemma I face. But again, the courts may eventually, may be asked to decide on this matter, as the opposition mentioned. Now, this bill it's eight years in coming. It's long overdue. And I think it is really an indictment on all in Parliament that, for not pushing this bill faster, because we have seen the economic repercussions that can occur. We have seen that, even Trinidad and Tobago, we have been blacklisted by certain travel advisory, one in-person citizens from Europe, America, coming into Trinidad. They have blacklisted us already, saying that here we have a crime, a great degree of crime in our country, to be careful. So now I think it's unfair now that we are now being blacklisted again in the economic stage, where it looks like, that people may want to invest here. We may want to go abroad, and we may not be able to invest in such a manner. So being on this economic blacklist, or grey list, as some people say, again, that brings into the effect that, it's coming into play that, it's a lot of us to bear as ordinary citizens what's going to happen. So they are looking at what's happening in Parliament. What are we doing here? What are we doing here to help the economic burden, to help Trinidad and Tobago as a nation to be able to, in the world stage, to be better geared? We already have the crime. Let us not look at that economic fallout that may occur with this bill not being able to pass. What would happen if students who cannot afford to pay their university fees, if it reaches that stage where banks abroad may not want to accept money from Trinidad. What will happen to patients who have been already seeking medical attention abroad, having to pay for medical attention abroad, if suddenly the banks there were saying, hey, we are not going to be taking monies from certain countries who have been blacklisted. So all these are factors that we have to look, see how it will come in, how it will affect the ordinary citizen. Then we look at the fact that even in terms of terrorism, I was fortunate to be involved in certain talks with the Ministry of National Security and with 2 embassies, and we looked at the whole idea about terrorism. We were trying to figure what is in the mind of a terrorist. Why would a citizen, leave Trinidad, go get training to become a member of ISIS? And when we looked at all these factors, the economic gain, how money is transferred from one country to another, how it is funded, all these are important factors. Trinidad, according to the United States Department of State, in Ref World, they looked at the country reports on terrorism 2016 in an article 19th of July 2017. And in that article on terrorism, we were listed as the highest country in the Western Hemisphere that could have members join in ISIS. So we already have that label on us. We have that label of crime. We have that label on terrorism. And this bill will help us along that line. This bill will actually help us look at any sort of funding activities, any sort of funding and financing of any sort of terrorist and terrorist acts. So again, this bill is very important, not only in the economic climate, but in our whole concept, how people look at us in Trinidad and Tobago as a terrorist state. It will show that as a country, we are serious in trying to curb that image that we have. Now, this bill also speaks to the money laundering effect that we were trying to look at. But this money laundering effect of the bill, it's since 1986, after the Scott drug report, we knew about certain big players. We knew about the need to follow that money. Then the Procedure of Crime Act in 2000, brought about by the Basil Pandey administration. Again, we were looking, the country looked on to see what was Parliament doing to go after, to follow the money, to go after the money laundering. So from 1986, 2000, we looked at the Procedures of Crime Act. Then in 2009, the Financial Intelligence Unit was set up by the Patrick Manning administration, the FIU. And then following on that, we were reminded of Minister Ahye's 2014, under the previous government of Kamala Prasad Bisesa, further pushing for the bill to be, laws to be implemented in looking at money laundering. So it seems it was an effort right through from successive governments, handing over the baton, and it's a long process. So it's not just 8 years ago. It's since 1986 we knew there was a need to do something about money laundering. So it seems that if we are reaching this stage, and this government seems to be now having that baton, willing to at least carry it to another level, I am looking at this process that we have to continue this process. It is necessary. It is needed for the economic sense, for the image of terrorism. It is needed for our citizens to be able to go abroad to study medical. It is needed. It is needed, and I see the need of it. I have also seen the effects of the ills of drugs in society. I mean, it's there. Our clinics are being filled with persons on drugs, and we have also heard Senator Vieira speak about the fact that, certain persons are untouchables. So you go after the small man, but the big fish, they are getting away. So the crime fallout from the drug trade, all this, we have to show that we are now serious about money laundering. The Attorney General mentioned about $22.2 billion, in suspected financial transaction takes place. And there was an article in the Express 2018, the April 11th article, where they said there was a 500% increase in the value that we see with suspected financial transaction between 2016 and 2017. That is a 500% increase. That's a lot. So a lot of money, $22.2 billion in suspected financial transactions. So we have to stop it. We have to get some way of saying that this is a serious government, this is a serious parliament, we are serious people here, and we need to do something about it. All of us need to do something about it to stop this, financial impropriety that is occurring. We have to put some measures to restrict it. And the AG had mentioned that the Al Capone was not...
Please. Madam President, in accordance with Standing Order 14.5, I beg to move that the Senate continue to sit until the completion of the business at hand.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the Senate continue to sit until the completion of the business at hand. Those in...
I don't want them to...
Including the two matters on the adjournment.
Yes, out of abundance of caution.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the Senate continue to sit until the completion of the business at hand. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The Senate will continue to sit until the completion of the business at hand. Continue, Senator Deyalsingh.
Thank you, Madam President. I will be very, very quickly. I'm almost to the end. The Attorney General had mentioned that Al Capone was not brought down by any sort of the criminal activities per se, but he was actually brought down by the suspected financial transactions. And with this point, we have to say, now in closing, I would like to say in supporting this bill, if supporting this bill, it would allow us to bring down our local Al Capones or our local Mr. Big. And, I would welcome this bill in the sense that, if somehow we see we can get the big fish, the untouchables, if this bill could provide a net to capture the big fish, then I would be happy to see the government hopefully go fishing soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President, for allowing me to make a contribution tonight. As usual, I'm going to be short. Madam President, while I understand that the bill being debated is mandatory for meeting the international standards, the question I have is whether this version of the tax amendment bill satisfies some or all of the requirements of FATF, Global Forum, etc. Given that we are on a grey or blacklist, because I'm not sure what we're on, will Trinidad and Tobago be removed from the negative status as a result of the passage of this bill? Looking ahead, Madam President, come January 2019, when Trinidad and Tobago will be reviewed by FATF, will we be able to meet the requirements of these international financial and tax bodies? Or will we fall over the edge into financial hardships and economic ruin? Madam President, I look forward to clarity and assurances by the Honourable Attorney General that the strategies and tactics employed in this House today will ensure that the stated requirements of the various international bodies are met. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Haynes.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for allowing me to join the debate on this income tax amendment bill. I would just seek to contextualize my presentation very quickly as I begin. So I would like to respond to some utterances that were made in this House, because I think that they were deliberately placed on the record to create an inaccurate picture, and I will just address those as part of my contribution. I will seek to explain concisely why we as an opposition cannot support this bill and why we cannot support this approach to legislation. I will itemize the pains we took as a responsible opposition to ensure that we had good legislation before us which is not what is before us today. And in doing so, I will address some concerns on collaboration and a need for collaboration in the passage of legislation. So I will begin with what was put on the record today. We heard from 3 government speakers, all of whom stated this is a simple bill. It began with the Attorney General, repeated by the Minister in the Ministry of Finance, and repeated by the Minister of Agriculture. This is a simple bill. And this refrain, Madam President, we have heard time and time again. And I was not in any way shocked to hear it on this income tax amendment bill, because the process by which this bill came here was something we have seen before, which is a government that sought to manufacture chaos around legislation and create a lot of noise and create a sense of urgency so that we as a parliament seems forced to...
Speak, Madam President.
Continue, Senator Haynes.
Thank you, Madam President. And I think that this being the 4th year of this administration, we've seen this with different pieces of legislation. We saw it with FATCA, we saw it with Antigua. This idea of taking us down to the wire and saying it has to be now, in a deadline. So this takes me to the this is a simple bill response. You see, I would just like to translate that, because we have a number of new senators here on the independent bench. And those who were here before would support me on this, that this is a simple bill, can be interpreted as we accepting no amendments, nobody to come with your concerns, this is what you're getting, this is what you're leaving with. This is a simple bill, means this is a simple majority. We do not need you, we do not need your vote, we do not need your voices. And don't waste your time, basically. And starting with the point of emphasizing simplicity, of always emphasizing the simplicity of the bill, is getting frustrating for me as a student of political science, simply because what are you asking us to do as parliamentarians? Are you asking us to be derelict in our duty? Because this is a simple bill, don't read it, just pass it. Are you asking us to abscond on our role to scrutinize? Because this House is meant to scrutinize legislation and ensure that good legislation is passed. Are you asking us to ignore our oath to uphold the Constitution? Is that what this is a simple bill means? The Attorney General said, this is a simple bill which had a complicated process to get here. There's a direct quote. And Madam President, through you, I'd just like to say to the Attorney General, the process is complicated, the legislative process is complicated by design. It is meant to be difficult. If you are bringing legislation, you are creating laws. It is not supposed to be this easy. We come, we talk, we laugh a little bit, everybody votes yes and goes home. It can't work like that. At the beginning of this, and the reason the opposition had to take a lot of flack, because initially it was meant to be a 3/5, and the bill was intended to, and in some ways, infringe on the rights of citizens. And by design, that process has to be complicated, Madam President. It has to be a complex process. And I heard, not in here today, and perhaps in the wind-up, because it usually comes up, this idea of obstructionist politics. The opposition is obstructionist, and that phrase amuses me, because it's borrowing from the American system, where they've borrowed fake news, another pedestrian term they like to throw around all the time. And it's done, if you whittle that down, obstructionist politics, to the lowest common denominator, it really talks about a government who has failed as policymakers. So what you're meeting is not an obstruction. You failed to bring the proper legislation. And I want to endorse the questions that Senator Seepersad had, because I can guarantee the answers to those questions will not be satisfactory. There'll be a lot of words, but there will be no answer, no direct answer to those questions. A lot of words. And so in response to simple bill, I would just like to state, going forward, the legislative process is meant to be grueling, it is meant to be rigorous, it is meant to be thorough, and we make no apologies for that. And no government, Madam President, and I mean no government, should feel like it is simple and easy to do away with constitutional rights. And I think it is important as well that I listened to the Attorney General as he began his presentation, and we began the discussion on this bill. And my mind went back to when Senator Mark asked a question in April of this year about whether or not we were on the European Union blacklist. And that stood out to me because the day Senator Mark asked that question, the Attorney General stood up and said, no. But I had done the research, and I knew the answer to be yes. So I found it on my computer. And I passed the computer to Senator Mark, and the Attorney General got up and said, well, I can't accept anything that Senator Mark has to say. You have to cite your source. And so the opposition is put in an unenviable position of always trying to disprove an untruth. So that so it is a convoluted process of having to say, but here it is. This is it. It's in black and white. And you're being told, well, that's not true. And you don't have to defend your position. You just say it. And so I picked up this Hansard from April 26, 2018, and I pointed to two things, because people are asking, why are we here now? We need to pass this legislation. It is important. And I want to just note the timelines here. April 26th, the Attorney General noted that the government of Trinidad and Tobago have provided high-level political commitment to the EU on November 21st, 2017, and another commitment on March 14th, 2018, to ensure Trinidad and Tobago is in full compliance with the Council of the European Union criteria. Why, then, are we in this breakneck speed, rushed process? If you made these commitments, you spoke about it, and Senator Rambharat asked the question and gave us a counting lesson, but 1, 2, and 3. But they've always referred to the legislation as a package. This whole idea of 1, 2, and 3 appeared out of nowhere, but it has always been understood that this was a package of legislation meant to cure a particular ill. And again, going back to Senator Seepersad's question, what are we doing here today? Are we curing any of those ills? Highly unlikely. And so therefore, this flurry of activity was carefully orchestrated. The timing should not be lost on any of us at all. When this conversation took its heat, when there was 3 press conferences in one day, Petrotrain was closing down, right, that same day. So let us not be naive as to why this happened in the manner in which it did. And now I turn to comments made by Senator West, touched on by Senator Obika, but I just want to take a slightly different angle here, which is the comment that we committed, but we did nothing. You see, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the problem is. The problem is not the commitment. The problem is not our international obligations. The problem is not having an agreement which we are obligated to pass certain pieces of legislation. Senator Ramdeen made the point that the law in and of itself is flawed. And we are also prosecuting that the process by which this is done was also a flawed process. And we have to ask today, what happens if this bill is passed? Nothing, right? What happens if it's not passed? What are we actually doing here today? And I have said it, I have had to say it before on other pieces of legislation. I don't understand why we put the time and the effort to do things in a halfway manner. We keep hearing we have to start somewhere, you have to start somewhere. Oh, well, one of these, try to get it right. Anyone. pick one, get one right, and then I'll say, all right, we have to start somewhere. But you keep saying start somewhere and keep giving us flawed legislation and making our task more difficult. And so when you look at the 5 clauses that we have before us, do any of them contain a solution to the problems that the government has itemized? And Madam President, the last comment that I had to raise was on this idea of collaboration and working together. The opposition has maintained from the very beginning that we are willing to work with this government for the passage of good legislation. We have demonstrated that time and time again, even though they are conveniently blind to the fact that when we help, the legislation gets better. And instead of being genuinely collaborative, Madam President, and the Hansard of April 26th is important too, because the Attorney General presupposed that we would not be supporting the bill. And I get the sense that they were hoping for this kind of situation to play out because it gives them a very comfortable space, the only comfortable space that they can work in, which is we trying, but they don't want to help us. It's not true. Do the right thing, and we will help you. We will assist.
Senator Haynes, you've been speaking for a little while now, and I've given you that leeway, but you need to get a little more specific to the issues at hand.
Thank you, Madam President. As it would come, I was at the end of the contribution. I was just making the final 3 points, because I said I was dealing with 3 things, and I'm on the collaborative effort, and that's the end. The opposition raised certain issues that were not addressed. The government, via the Prime Minister, asked to meet with the leader of the opposition to iron out these issues. And that meeting was due to take place on Friday morning. We, as a team, because that is how we work, were diligently prepping because we assumed that we were coming to do the work necessary to give Trinidad and Tobago the best possible piece of legislation last Friday. As we were working and prepping, TV was on in the background, and the PNM meeting is going on. And we heard the meeting that we were preparing to go to, taking very seriously. Anyone, pick one, right? A sham. It was, I agree. Calling the meeting with the opposition leader a sham. And then telling us that we ought to be collaborative. We were preparing for the meeting very seriously, very seriously. And so, Madam President, when persons ask, oh gosh, don't get antsy, don't get antsy.
I don't know why everybody wants to speak at the same time. Please let us listen to Senator Haynes in silence. Senator Haynes.
Thank you, Madam President. And at the end of the day, when you come here and you say we can work together, we could pass good legislation, and then that is your subsequent behavior, as Senator Mark noted, we simply cannot trust anything the government has to say. And so when you are willing to do the right thing, when you are willing to do the right thing to take us off the blacklist, we are here and we are willing to help. Until then, I guess you would have to take passing inconsequential pieces of legislation. Thank you, Madam President.
Attorney General.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise to...
Attorney General, yes. Honourable Senators, I will now suspend the sitting for 15 minutes.